Hello and welcome. We're continuing in our study of the book of Judges. We're up to Judges chapter 8 and we'll be finishing our story about Gideon. So grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get started. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I really look forward to hearing and reading some of your comments. Our trigger warning for today is that this study will contain references to violence. So, Judges chapter 8 verses 1. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went out to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. The men of the tribe of Ephraim, they criticised Gideon for not inviting them to fight against the Midianites in the last chapter. We can see in Judges 6 and in Judges chapter 7 that the Ephraimites were specifically excluded from the call to fight against the Midianites. The Ephraimites may have been motivated to raise this with Gideon because maybe of a sense of jealousy. But Gideon, he answered them, the Ephraimites, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you?" And at this, their resentment against him subsided. So Gideon compares the Ephraimites' significant accomplishments, their abundant harvest, their military victories, to his own smaller ones. And Gideon responds to Ephraim's injured pride with a little bit of flattery, and Ephraim is quickly appeased. The reference to Abiezer is a reference to Gideon's family. Abiezer is presumed to be a descendant of Manasseh, so an ancestor of Gideon. Verse 4, Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted yet keeping up pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. He said to the men of Succoth, "Give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." So Gideon has only 300 exhausted men. They are strategically reduced by God to minimal numbers so that he would get the glory for the victory and the honour wouldn't go to Gideon. So the army is still in pursuit of Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian, and they arrive at the town of Succoth, which is in the tribe of Dan. Gideon requests the city of Succoth to support him to fight against the battle, or to support his army to continue fighting the battle. He didn't ask them to engage in the actual battle to pursue the kings of Midian, but he simply asked for support to provide bread to strengthen the men in battle. So the men of Succoth, it has two different spellings, but it's first mentioned in the Bible back in Genesis 33 with a story about Jacob meeting Esau. And the word Succoth means booths, it means tents, so it's implying the transitory nature or the nomadic nature of Jacob at that time. But Succoth became a part of the territory given to the descendants of Gad. But the officials in Succoth said, "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops?" And the officials of Succoth declined Gideon's request for bread for his 300 hungry soldiers. The officials of Succoth are resistant in supporting because they are in pursuit of Zebah and Zalmunna, but they haven't yet got them. It might be a fear of the officials of Succoth that if Gideon's army fails to kill the two kings of Midian and they are defeated themselves, it's a waste of precious bread that could be used to sustain the men of Succoth, especially if they have to then fight the Midianites later, when the Midianites find out that Succoth directly had supported Gideon's army. Verse 7, Then Gideon replied, "Just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hands, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars." In response to Succoth's decline to help, Gideon promises to teach them a lesson, to tear their flesh with desert thorns and briars. And it's interesting to contrast the attitude of the men of Ephraim at the beginning of this chapter and their desire to help in battle to these men here at Succoth, the tribe of Dan, who are trying their hardest to avoid helping defeat the Midianites, even though Midian is still their enemy. Verse 8. From there he went up to Peniel and made the same request of them. But they answered, as the men of Succoth had. So he said to them, to the men of Peniel, when I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower. So from Succoth, Gideon went east to Peniel, and the officials of Peniel responded in the same way as the men at Succoth had, possibly because of the same fears. Gideon promises to destroy the tower when he returns in victory. In ancient times, watchtowers were constructed to survey the land, to safeguard against threats, and to provide guidance to communities. And in vowing to destroy Succoth's tower, Gideon is threatening to make them more vulnerable than they currently are. And with or without the help of Succoth and Peniel, Gideon knew that he would win the battle. He said, when I return in triumph. Not if I return in triumph, when I return in triumph. Gideon had changed from the man that we see threshing wheat in the winepress, and he is now confident in God. Gideon went from knowing that he was a weak to being a hero in Israel. He no longer operated out of weakness, but he operated out of strength because of his faith in God. Verse 10, now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordmen had fallen. Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Nobar and Jogbeth and attacked the unsuspecting army. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. So the kings of Midian are now at Karkor, southeast of Peniel. Now, notice how reduced the Midianite army is. They started with 135,000 soldiers, and now they only have 15,000 soldiers. 120,000 soldiers have died in battle, but we still need to remember that Gideon's army is only 300 strong. So perhaps Gideon was bold enough to fight such odds because he had seen firsthand that God had done great things in similar circumstances before. The previous work of God encouraged him to trust God in great things in the present. The Midianite army was not suspecting the attack, which had made them vulnerable to Gideon's attack from the caravan route. Gideon captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and they routed the rest of the army. Verse 13, Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Heres. He caught a young man of Succoth, and he questioned him. And the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth and the elders of the town. So in order to determine who the leaders of Succoth were, Gideon caught and he questioned this young man. And by definition of the word young man, it could be assumed that this man is between the age of 12 and 40 years of age. That's a bit broad, but we know he wouldn't be younger than 12 because he's not referred to as a child. As a point of interest, the fact that this young man of Succoth could write demonstrates the educational level of men in this area and at this time. Verse 15, then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about who you taunted me, saying, do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men? He took the elders of the town and he taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert briars and thorns. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. So Gideon, he returns to Succoth and Peniel with Zebah and Zalmunna and fulfills what he had vowed to do with their officials, and when they had refused, to give him bread. He pursues the men of Succoth with thorns and briars, and he destroys the tower of Peniel and kills the men of that town. The lesson we need to learn here is that we need to be in full support of God's work. We should seek opportunities to support local, national, and international missions. And we can support by giving our time and our resources, but more importantly, we can uphold them in prayer. We need to be very, very wary not to discourage or actively inhibit any ministry, any work of God. Verse 18. Then he, Gideon, asks Zebah and Zalmunna, "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" And they answered, "Men like you, each one having the bearing of a prince." And Gideon replied, "They were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you." So apparently these two Midianite kings were responsible for the death of Gideon's own brothers. And it's deeply painful for Gideon to hear that Zebah and Zalmunna have killed his brothers. And Gideon acknowledges that he would have spared their lives had they not done such a horrendous deed. But because they had killed men that were dear to him, Gideon feels the need to avenge his brothers. Verse 20. Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, "Kill them." But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid. And Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Come, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." So Gideon stepped forward and he killed them, and he took the ornaments off their camels' necks. Jether, Gideon's son, was only a boy. Generally, young men were older than 13, as we said before, and so Gideon's son was less than 12 years old. And what was Gideon thinking? To ask his son to kill two men. Perhaps he wanted his firstborn son to experience battle or to receive the accolades from the nation for rescuing them for those two kings. But to ask a juvenile to do an adult's job is simply traumatizing to a child. Badly done, Gideon. Badly done. Zebah and Zalmunna taunt Gideon by suggesting that if he was a real man, a strong man, that he would kill them himself. And Zebah and Zalmunna knew how to get Gideon's attention by personally attacking his pride. So some commentators suggest that the taunting was a disguised hope that a strong and experienced warrior would kill them quickly rather than a tentative and uncertain young boy taking a longer time to complete the task. A quick and painful death is far preferable than a slow, painful death. Now Gideon has victory over Midian. He has significantly decreased the size of Midianites' army, and he has routed those who have remained, and he has killed the kings and the princes. He is far from the weak man that we see in the wine press. He's now strong, he's supported, he's prominent, but beware, Gideon, because we are at our most likely to fall away from God when we feel a sense of strength, because we feel that we don't need our God. Verse 22, the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." The desire for a human king over Israel started early in the nation's history. Hundreds of years later, in the days of Samuel, the prophet and the judge, God gave Israel a king they asked for. So see 1 Samuel chapter 18. But at this time, Israel had no king. God was their king. However, the Canaanites around them, they did have kings. Verse 23, but Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my sons rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." So Gideon, he declines the invitation to become king. And Gideon appears to understand that the Old Testament prohibits the appointment of a king because Yahweh was always intended to be their king. And declining the invitation to be Israel's king was the right response. Gideon understood that there was no place to take over the throne of Israel and that the Lord was going to be king over Israel. Verse 24, he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring of your share of the plunder." It was customary customary for the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. So Gideon definitely gave the right answer when he said he didn't want to be king, yet the rest of the chapter he acted like a king. He received riches, he received many wives and concubines, and he retained a large army. So his words are humble, but his actions were not. It's easier to talk the talk of humility in service to God than to actually live it. So instead of continuing to depend on God, Gideon drifts away, and we see his arrogance play out against the people of Israel. Gideon asks each of the men for a gold earring from their plunder. And the wealthy man of Canaan wore an earring, a gold earring, and these earrings were removed from the dead soldiers. Verse 25, they answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. And the weight of these gold earrings that were asked came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, the gold garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on the camels' necks. So notice the volume of wealth here. The people were happy to give this, and it's hard to say that Gideon didn't deserve reasonable compensation, but at the same time it's inappropriate because the incredible wealth donated to him lifted him up far above the level of the people that he was leading, and it was at their expense. Gideon went from being the lowest of the low in Judges chapter 6 to being a millionaire overnight. So the gold earrings that were donated from the 300 men, they amounted to about 22 kilograms, which in 2025 was worth $1.6 million in Australia. Then they had the crescent ornaments of the camels. That probably would have been 2 crescent ornaments on each side of the camel's head, plus pendants, plus purple robes, plus the neck bands on the camels. So obviously they're different to the ornaments worn on the heads of the camel mentioned earlier. The crescent ornaments and the pendants may have been of religious significance to the people of Canaan. So melting them down in verse 27 may have shown their powerlessness. What do you think of this quote by David Guzik? A general rule of thumb is that Christian leaders who make their living from the gifts of God people should live at the level of their own people, not below, not above. So a point to church leaders, are you living an excessively lavish lifestyle way beyond the reach of your congregation? Is your wealth considered consistently increasing at the expense of your congregation's personal needs? Or a point to congregation members, do you ensure that your paid minister or missionaries receive sufficient and financial support for their current needs and for their retirement? Because there are many retired pastors that have no personal assets like a house or any superannuation plans. So consider how we treat our leaders financially. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his own town. And Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So Gideon creates an ephod, and the people worship it. And some commentators suggest that it's a golden garment, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and others suggest that it's a golden idol, more like a physical object. But either way, Gideon's ephod causes the Israelites to fall away from God. So an ephod was an elaborate and ornate piece of clothing worn by the high priest. And on top of each of the shoulders was fastened 2 onyx clasps. Sometimes people who weren't high priests wore linen garments, which was the case we see in Samuel and in David. Ephods were closely associated with hearing from God and determining his will, since they were directly related to the priesthood, and they were the only ones who were allowed near the presence of God. The Urim and the Thummim were carried by the high priests of Israel on the ephod, so it sort of tucked inside the ephod, inside the priestly garments. Gideon violated the first and second of the 10 Commandments and the regulations of the priest by creating an ephod outside the bounds of the Levitical law. Even though Gideon refuses to be king, when the people ask him, he still acts like a king by taking gold from the people, and then he acts like a priest by creating an ephod for them to worship. Verse 28, Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. Gideon's victory creates a peace for 40 years, supporting the cycle of sin. So the cycle of sin is the enemy oppresses God's people, the people cry out to God, God sends a judge, the enemies are defeated, and there is peace in the land. Until Israelite forgets God and they fall back into sin and get oppressed by another enemy. Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own because he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son whose name was Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Gideon had so many wives, just like a crowned king would. He had many wives, and consequently he conceived many sons, 70 sons. And I think it's reasonable to presume that maybe he may have had a similar number of daughters as well. And then we are told here about a new character, Abimelech, his son, the son of a concubine. And we will study him in the next chapter, in Judges chapter 9. Verse 33, No sooner had Gideon died that the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Now that Israel is experiencing a time of peace, it's no surprise that Israel returns to their old ways, forgetting God and worshipping other gods. They didn't worship God or acknowledge that he was the one who had saved them from the oppression of the Israelites. And they disobeyed God and they worshipped other idols. Gideon's stories shows us that the problem isn't actually with Israel's oppression from their enemies. The problem is Israel themselves. Verse 35, they also failed to show loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in spite of all the good things he had done for them. Although Israel did not treat Gideon and his family with honour and gratitude, we do see him mentioned in the New Testament in the Great Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11, verse 32 to 34. And Gideon is recognised for his faith. Although through our study, we do see Gideon grow in great faith. From a scared man threshing wheat in a winepress to leading a numerically inferior army to defeat the strong and numerous Midianite army, because he trusted God, and God used Gideon to bless the nation. I hope you've enjoyed this session today as we've looked at Judges chapter 8, and I look forward to sharing some time with you next time in Judges chapter 7. Thank you. Bye.